In nearly 3 decades, Vince Carter built a resume that NBA history has no choice but to record in bold ink. NBA Rookie of the Year. In 1999, 8-time All-Star, more than 25,000 career points, and most importantly, the Slam Dunk Contest in 2000, where he didn't just win, he redefined what a dunk could mean for an entire generation. That night, every leap Carter took seemed to freeze time, making the entire league realize they were witnessing something that transcended ordinary sports. He became a global cultural icon, the man who wore the nickname half man, half amazing, the face of an era when basketball was equal parts power, art, and imagination. At the Sydney Olympics in 2000, his dunk over a 7-foot-plus opponent turned him into a legend that extended far beyond the NBA, etching his name into the world's sports memory. With the Toronto Raptors, Carter wasn't just a star, he was the foundation, the reason an entire city began to believe basketball could become part of its identity. When his career stretched across 4 different decades of the NBA, an unprecedented feat, Vince Carter was no longer simply a player. He became a living witness to the league's evolution, from the wild late 1990s era to the modern age of analytics and pace. But as those achievements piled up, another reality quietly emerged, far more silent and far more brutal, because behind every award was a price never engraved on any trophy, and behind every dunk were thousands of landings that slammed straight into knees, back, and legs that slowly wore down over the years. When the arena lights dimmed, Vince Carter stepped into his second life, a life with no applause, where morning workouts echoed only with the lonely sound of a bouncing ball, where the bench felt colder than any loss ever could. He was still on the court, but his name was no longer called with excitement. No one was really waiting for him anymore. What hurts more than failure? Not losing a game or missing a championship, but continuing to exist after the world has moved on, when the legendary version of you becomes a shadow that obscures the real person. For 30 years, Vince Carter lived 2 parallel lives. One the public saw, where he was forced to carry the immortal image of Vincanity on his shoulders, and one private life, where he learned to endure in silence, to shrink his role, to step back so he could stay. His will no longer lay in jumping higher than everyone else. It lay in still stepping onto the court even when no one was waiting, still training when his body protested, still choosing to continue when every rational voice told him to stop. And it is in that quiet persistence that the real story of Vince Carter truly begins. The story of a man who lived long enough to understand that sometimes staying in silence hurts more than leaving in defeat, but is also more noble than any standing ovation. If you want to understand what really shaped Vince Carter behind the arena lights and why he accepted living 2 lives for 30 years, hit subscribe and join us on this journey. Vince Carter's childhood didn't begin with loud, tragic stories or losses big enough to make people stop and pity him. But the very absence of dramatic tragedy created a different kind of harshness, quieter and more enduring. He grew up in a family where discipline wasn't called discipline. It was simply the way things were. Expectations didn't need to be spoken because they were always present in every meal, every morning waking up, every glance the adults gave to a child growing up faster than he should have. No one in Vince Carter's family ever told him life would be hard, because they believed saying it out loud would only weaken a child. Instead, they let him figure it out by watching, by silently observing the people around him grinding through their responsibilities every day, without complaining, without whining, without allowing themselves to be tired. In that house, there was no room for weakness to be spoken aloud, no space for mistakes to be cushioned with sympathy. Everything operated under an unspoken rule: do well or do better. If you can't yet, adjust yourself. Don't wait for someone to come save you. Vince learned that lesson very early, not through one big event, but through hundreds of small moments when he realized No one had time to stop and ask how he felt. And so, while other kids were allowed to show fear, allowed to cry, allowed to make mistakes, Vince Carter learned to swallow everything inside, learned to keep a calm face, even when his heart hadn't yet caught up to what was happening. Silence gradually became a survival skill, not because he wanted to seem tough, but because it was the only way not to become a burden to anyone. His family wasn't cruel. They just believed the world outside was crueler, and they prepared Vince by teaching him to stand straight before he learned how to fall. But what no one noticed at the time was that every time Vince quietly adjusted himself in silence, he was also learning to hide his emotions, learning not to seek comfort from the outside, learning to exist without needing to be seen. Those unspoken high expectations slowly carved into him a familiar feeling. If I'm not good enough, it's my fault. If I'm tired, endure a little more. If I'm in pain, wait until no one is looking. Vince Carter's childhood didn't allow him to be weak, not because he was forbidden, but because no one ever taught him that weakness was a valid choice. He grew up in order, in steady routines, in days that passed without incidents to justify sadness, and that very fact made sadness, when it did appear, much harder to name. Vince never learned how to ask for pity, because he never saw anyone around him do it. He also never learned how to express himself, because expressing didn't bring any clear benefit in the world he was taught to observe. Instead, he learned how to prepare, how to quietly perfect himself, how to take responsibility for everything that happened to him, good or bad. Those years laid the foundation for a person who would grow up with remarkable self-control, but also with a dangerous habit, hiding every crack until they became part of the structure. When Vince Carter began playing basketball seriously, no one had to remind him about discipline. It was already there, deeply embedded in the way he thought and reacted to the world. He wasn't the loud kid on the court, not the one seeking attention with words or gestures. He played the way he had learned to live. Work hard. Don't explain. Don't ask to be understood. And it was in that silence that a special kind of person was formed, not to shine immediately, but to endure long-term. The childhood that didn't allow Vince Carter to be weak taught him how to stand firm under pressure, but at the same time, it took away something very human, the right to say out loud when he was tired. That was the first price, small enough that no one noticed, but big enough to shape his entire later life. A life where silence was no longer just a choice, but an instinct. When Vince Carter stepped foot into the University of North Carolina, he didn't just join one of the most prestigious basketball programs in America. He stepped into a system where discipline was placed above all individuality, where talent was only accepted if it agreed to stand behind the collective. UNC wasn't a place that nurtured stars who wanted to explode on instinct. It was a place that trained people to know how to shrink themselves to serve a larger structure. There, Vince Carter learned that flying high didn't automatically earn praise, scoring a lot didn't automatically earn trust, and being different definitely didn't earn protection. Everything he carried from his childhood, the silence, the self-control, the habit of not demanding, suddenly became an advantage, but also the first trap of his playing career. He was required to suppress his instincts, required to choose the safe pass over the impulsive leap, reminded that every moment of individual brilliance could throw off the rhythm of the entire team. UNC didn't tell Vince outright that he couldn't be himself. They simply kept showing him that being himself was a risk, while compliance was the path to acceptance. And Vince, as he had always done, accepted it in silence. He played efficiently, smartly, within the system. The team won. The collective was celebrated. But deep down, an unnamed emptiness began to form. Because every game that passed, without a moment where he was allowed to unleash his instincts, was another time Vince learned to push a part of himself aside. Collective success came steadily, but personal joy did not. The applause for UNC couldn't soothe the feeling that he was present yet somehow not existing, contributing to victories while slowly fading from his own story. Vince didn't resist, didn't complain, didn't try to rebel, because from very early on, he had understood that resistance would only get him removed from the game. Instead, he chose to adapt, chose to become proper, chose to do everything just enough so no one had to mention his name in a negative way. And it was in that adaptation that he discovered a cruel rule. UNC didn't need to teach out loud. To survive in a large system, sometimes you have to accept disappearing as an individual. Vince Carter learned to turn his talent into a tool, not a voice, to use his athleticism when permitted, and hide it when it wasn't needed. The long practices, the dry instructions, the subtle glances reminding him everything had limits, slowly wore down the sense of freedom basketball had once given him. He began to understand that recognition here didn't come from who you were, but from how well you could fit in. And Vince fit perfectly, to the point that people gradually forgot there was an instinct to break out being tightly compressed inside that calm player. UNC gave him a solid foundation, a sharp tactical mind, an iron discipline that the NBA would later respect. But it also took away from him the rare years when a young player could play basketball purely for joy. Vince took the court with the precision of someone who had grown up too soon, but left it with an emptiness he didn't yet know how to name. At an age when many were still fumbling to find their identity, Vince had already learned to hide his in order to survive. He didn't leave UNC in failure, nor did he leave in personal glory. He left as a part of a smoothly running machine, carrying with him a lesson that would follow him throughout his career. The world will love you more when you know how to make yourself smaller. And that very lesson, seemingly harmless, became the seed for Vince Carter's later double life. A life where he always knew how to stand in the right place, play the right role, but rarely got to live fully as his true self. When Vince Carter set foot in Toronto, he didn't just change teams. He stepped into a city that was desperately hungry to see itself on the world basketball map. The Raptors were young then, fragile, without enough history to lean on. And Toronto, a sprawling metropolis that always felt like it stood on the sidelines of the NBA, needed an icon to believe in. Vince Carter arrived at exactly the right moment, too perfectly, to the point that every gap was instantly filled with his image. From the very first practices, from the opening games, the eyes of the entire city fixed on the shoulders of a young player who hadn't yet fully understood what he was representing. No one asked if he was ready. No one gave him time to become himself. Toronto needed a face, and Vince Carter became that face before he could even become a complete person in that role. The city placed its entire identity on his shoulders through unspoken expectations, through articles, billboards, and promotional spots, repeating the image of a young man soaring through the air, as if gravity had never existed. Vince was no longer simply a player. He became collective hope, the answer to the question, who are the Raptors? The reason Toronto kids wore jerseys and believed their team deserved to be named. And along with that hope came another role, far heavier, marketing tool. Vince Carter's image appeared everywhere, from the arena to advertising campaigns, from television to stories retold like a new NBA miracle. The spotlight arrived too fast, too blinding to leave any shade behind. In that whirlwind, no one saw a young man still learning to live away from home, still carrying the habits of silence from childhood and UNC, still unaccustomed to every step he took being scrutinized and interpreted. Vince Carter played as if he were trying to answer everyone at once. The fans, his teammates, the city, the league. Every leap he made wasn't just a play. It was reassurance that Toronto had placed its faith in the right place. And when he soared, the whole city soared with him, forgetting that the human being inside those shoes was carrying far too much without anyone asking if he wanted to carry it Vince gradually understood that he was no longer allowed to be inconsistent, no longer allowed to have off days, no longer allowed to be tired, because every such display would be read as a betrayal of collective trust. He became an image more than an individual, an icon more than a person, and that very adoration began to strip away his right to be weak. Toronto loved Vince Carter, but that love took the form of expectation, not understanding. The city needed him to always shine, needed him to soar high to cover the shortcomings of a still young team, needed him to be the center of every story, even if it meant all the pressure funneled in one direction. Vince didn't resist that role. He was too accustomed to silently accepting responsibility. But every time the lights went out, every time he left the court with the echoes of noise still ringing, the emptiness became clearer. He was living the life of an entire city, but he wasn't sure he was still living his own. From a young player full of potential, Vince Carter was compressed into a single icon, a template everyone wanted to see repeated over and over. And in that template, there was no room for slow growth, no room for necessary setbacks, no room for learning to mature in silence. Success came in waves, but maturity was forced to race along, forced to happen in front of the cameras. Vince felt clearly that every time he stepped onto the court, he wasn't just playing for the team, he was playing for an entire story the city had already written. He became the answer to Toronto's insecurity, to a collective's craving for recognition, and the price was gradually losing the boundary between human being and image. No one in the city intentionally turned him into an icon. They simply did the most natural thing when they found a hope that shone too brightly. But that very naturalness inadvertently locked Vince Carter into a role he couldn't escape without being seen as a traitor. The lights came too fast, and in that brightness, the shadows formed just as quickly. Vince Carter kept soaring, kept scoring, kept bringing joy, but deep inside, a quiet question grew larger. Would he ever be allowed to be a human being again, or would he forever be the icon the city needed, even if it meant he himself had to disappear behind that image? The slam dunk contest night in 2000 wasn't just a competition. It was the moment the entire basketball world collectively looked up and realized they were witnessing something unrepeatable. And right in that instant, Vince Carter stepped out of the boundaries of a mere player to become a legend born live in front of millions. As he began his run-up, the air in the arena seemed to get sucked out, and when his body left the ground, time appeared to slow down, just long enough for the whole world to understand that this was no longer pure basketball. It was a performance that defied the logic of gravity and the framework of sports. The first dunk made the crowd leap to their feet. The second made them unable to sit back down. And by the final ones, people stopped talking about scores or rules. They just stood there, stunned in front of something too immense to name. Television replayed every angle. The press used the biggest words they had. And in just a few minutes, Vince Carter no longer belonged to Toronto or the NBA. He belonged to the collective memory of an entire generation. The whole world hailed him as if they had just discovered a new definition of greatness, and that very acclaim stamped his life with a name that would follow him forever: Vincanity. But what no one noticed in that glorious night was that, as the cheers rose to their peak, as the soaring dunks were replayed endlessly on screens, something else was quietly happening. The real Vince Carter began to be overshadowed by the greatest moment of his life. From that second onward, he was no longer allowed to be a player, still learning to develop, still searching for identity, still maturing through each season. He was permanently framed in the image of a man who soared high, a gravity defier, an icon of explosion. Vincanity became a mask he could never remove, because every time Vince stepped onto the court afterward, the fans weren't waiting for a game or a complete performance. They were waiting for a reenactment of that night's miracle. Every leap was no longer a tactical choice. It became a reminder that he had to relive the moment that defined his entire career. And when he didn't soar as high as before, when his body no longer obeyed unconditionally, the silence grew heavier than any booze. The tragedy of Vince Carter didn't begin with failure. It began with a glory so complete, so early, that it became an insurmountable standard. In the years that followed, every effort he made to evolve long-range shooting, game-reading ability, maturity in a leadership role, was cast under the shadow of that 2000 night, as if everything else was just filler, compensation for when he could no longer fly. The real Vince Carter, the smart, disciplined, resilient player, gradually became imprisoned in the image the public loved but refused to let change. He began to understand that the world didn't love him for who he was, but for how he made them feel in one single moment. And the price of delivering that emotion was having to live forever under impossible expectations. Vincanity wasn't a harmless nickname. It was an unspoken contract, forcing Vince to reenact himself endlessly, forcing him to wear the mask of explosion even when inside. He only wanted to play basketball in a more sustainable, more human way. The tragedy started from glory, because that glory didn't grant him the right to change. Each passing season, Vince Carter still scored, still contributed, still worked in silence. But the question he heard most wasn't, "How have you improved?" but "Can you still fly like before?" And that question, repeated through the years, became the deepest cut. It reminded him that his real self had been replaced by a moment the world refused to let go of. The 2000 dunk contest night lifted Vince Carter to a peak no one else could reach, but it also locked him in an image he would have to carry for the rest of his career. An image so brilliant that every other aspect of him was deemed dim by comparison. In the unending cheers of glory, a painful truth began to take shape. From that moment on, Vince Carter was no longer allowed to age, no longer allowed to change, no longer allowed to be himself. And that was when his true tragedy quietly began. After the 2000 dunk contest night, Vince Carter entered a phase no one called tragedy, because on the surface everything still blazed with lights. But inside, he began to understand what it meant to be imprisoned by his own legend. The public, the media, and even the ticket buyers coming to the arena wanted only one thing: to relive the feeling they had when they watched him rise into the air, hanging suspended, as if defying nature itself. No one said it out loud, but every glance, every headline, every pre-game promo repeated the same message: Vince Carter is Vincanity, and Vincanity is the dunk. From then on, every game stopped being just a sports contest and became a 48-minute ongoing trial, where the only measure of satisfaction was whether he delivered the familiar miracle or not. Just one game without a dunk, one night of tactical basketball, and the atmosphere immediately shifted to disappointment, as if he had failed some invisible duty to the fans. Vince felt it clearly in every sigh from the stands, in the post-game comments, in the way people asked not about wins or contributions, but about whether he could still fly. And from there, a two-layered life began to form quietly but irreversibly. On the court, in front of thousands of eyes, Vince Carter had to become the version the world expected, ready to leap, ready to risk, ready to do the absurd, to satisfy the collective memory of that glorious night. He smiled, he played, he maintained the image of an icon always primed to explode, because that was what the public had loved and refused to lose. But inside, another Vince Carter existed, quieter, more realistic, where he clearly understood his body's limits, understood that endurance was the only path to long-term survival, understood that, if he kept living for others' expectations, he would destroy himself. Those two lives ran parallel without intersecting. One for the audience, where every run carried the pressure to reenact the legend, and one for himself, where he calculated every movement, every landing, every decision to protect what remained. Vince never shared that inner conflict with anyone, because he had grown accustomed to silence from childhood and UNC, accustomed to shouldering responsibility without demanding understanding. But silence didn't make the weight disappear. It only made it sink deeper, accumulating through each season. There were nights he left the court with a win in hand, yet the emptiness still followed, because he knew what satisfied the fans wasn't a well-played game, but some spectacular moment that hadn't happened. Vince Carter began to recognize a painful paradox. The more he tried to become a more complete, smarter, more durable player, the wider the gap grew between his real self and the public image. Every time he chose a pass over driving for a dunk, it was a correct basketball decision, but it was seen as an emotional shortcoming by those who came to the arena just to recapture the old feeling. And so, every game became a wordless courtroom, where judgment was delivered through applause or silence, through sensational headlines or repeated questions. Vince stood in the middle of it all, both the defendant and the only one who truly knew his own truth. He knew he couldn't win that trial, because there was no way to relive a past moment forever. But he also knew that completely abandoning the role meant losing the acceptance he had spent so many years building. And so, he chose the most exhausting path, continuing to play the legend for the public while quietly living another life for himself. Those two lives didn't bring liberation. They only helped him survive one more season, one more game, one more long night after the lights went out. Vince Carter wasn't imprisoned by coaches, contracts, or opponents. He was imprisoned by the very image the world had loved, too deeply to let him step out of. And in that invisible cage, he kept playing, kept smiling, kept bringing joy, while deep inside, he learned to endure a bitter truth. Sometimes the hardest thing isn't failure or being forgotten. It's having to live every day under the expectation that you will forever be the most brilliant version of yourself, even when the real person inside has been tired for a very long time. In the years following the peak of Vincanity, the relationship between Vince Carter and Toronto began to fracture in ways no one wanted to name, because on the surface, everything still carried the appearance of a star playing for the city. But inside, the breakdown had been happening for a very long time. Injuries appeared as the inevitable consequence of years spent flying too high and landing too often. Knees ached persistently, back stiffened, the body no longer responded instantly to commands that had once been executed unconsciously. Vince Carter still took the court, still played, but every game now demanded far greater mental effort than before, because he no longer just had to overcome opponents, he had to overcome a body that was gradually protesting. Fatigue was no longer a fleeting feeling after a tough game. It became a constant state, seeping into every practice, every flight, every night of restless tossing. When his knees hurt so much, he couldn't find a comfortable sleeping position. In that context, what Vince Carter needed most wasn't more praise, but understanding that a human being cannot live forever as an icon without being worn down. But Toronto, like much of the sports world, wasn't accustomed to watching an icon slow down. The media began to shift its tone, not loudly, not suddenly, but gradually cooler, like a prolonged winter wind. Articles that once celebrated his soaring ability now focused on the moments Vince could no longer do it. Slow-motion clips no longer meant to honor, but to compare, to remind everyone that he had changed. Vince Carter's image was bent little by little, not through direct accusations, but through repeated questions, subtly planted doubts. Was he still giving everything? Did he still deserve the city's trust? From the position of savior, the man who put Toronto on the NBA map, Vince gradually came to be seen as a betrayer, not because he did anything clearly wrong, but because he could no longer meet the unrealistic expectations his own success had created. With every passing game, the distance between Vince and the city grew wider, not because of lack of effort, but because of lack of dialogue. Vince didn't make excuses, didn't hold press conferences to explain his body, didn't talk about how long it took some mornings just to stand straight, didn't speak about the mental exhaustion of having every run scrutinized. He chose silence, because silence was the language he had learned from childhood, the way he had been taught to survive in systems with no room for weakness. But this time, silence was no longer armor. It became the wound. The media read that silence as indifference. The fans read it as betrayal. And the gap between what Vince was experiencing and what people believed grew wider and wider. There were nights he left the court amid a mix of boos and sparse applause, a feeling of isolation creeping into every step, because he knew the city that once loved him most no longer heard him, didn't even want to hear anymore. Injuries kept him from playing the way people remembered. Fatigue left him without the energy to argue, and the media's coldness made every quiet effort invisible. Vince Carter was trapped between two irreconcilable images, the real person trying to survive, and the icon the city wanted to keep frozen in memory. Every day spent in that atmosphere was another time he had to ask himself whether his silence was the right choice or just the continuation of a habit that had become dangerous. But whatever the answer, Vince still didn't break the silence, because he understood that once he started justifying himself, he would be pulled into a fight where no one truly wanted to understand the truth. And so, Toronto's breakup didn't happen through one dramatic moment, but through hundreds of small moments of not being heard. Vince Carter still took the court, still wore the jersey that once represented the hope of an entire city, but inside, he had begun leaving long ago, carrying a pain that couldn't be named. The pain of someone once loved for being an icon, but turned away from when he no longer fit the story others wanted to tell. Silence, which had once helped him survive, now became the deepest wound, because it allowed every misunderstanding to exist without resistance, and it was in that silence that the relationship between Vince Carter and Toronto came to an end, not with a clear goodbye, but with the bitter feeling that sometimes the greatest loss isn't being hated, but being misunderstood when there's no longer a chance to speak. Vince Carter's departure from Toronto didn't happen like a farewell. It felt more like a quiet escape, with no closing ceremony, no moment of reflection for both sides to understand each other better. When the decision to leave became reality, no one organized a beautiful goodbye. No one paused to ask why things had come to this. The city that once called him hope now remembered him only with anger, as if his departure was a personal betrayal rather than the result of years of accumulated fatigue, injuries, and silence. Vince Carter left Toronto with very few explanations, not because he had nothing to say, but because he had grown too accustomed to his words no longer being heard. In that atmosphere, every statement was twisted, every attempt to explain seen as an excuse, and Vince understood that sometimes saying more only pushed the story further from the truth. He chose to leave in solitude, because that was the only way to end a relationship that had become toxic for both sides. But that solitude didn't just exist in the moment of changing teams. It stretched on in the way people remembered him. In the years that followed, when Vince Carter's name was mentioned in Toronto, it often came with simplified stories, easy conclusions. He stopped trying. He turned his back on the city. He left when things got tough. Few mentioned the mornings he practiced in pain, the seasons he tried to adjust his game to survive, or the years he carried the expectations of an entire young collective on his shoulders. The complex truth was compressed into collective anger, because anger is easier to feel than understanding. Vince Carter didn't return to fix that memory, didn't try to rewrite the story in his favor. He carried that heaviness into the next chapter of his career, like a scar you don't need to see to know it's there. Leaving in solitude wasn't just leaving a city. It was accepting that there are places where you spent your entire youth building something, but in the end, there was no longer room for the real you. Vince entered the new phase of his career with a painful realization. Fame can come very quickly, but understanding does not. And sometimes, what lingers longest after a broken relationship isn't fond memories, but explanations that never get to happen. He kept playing, kept living with two parallel lives. But Toronto became a chapter closed in silence, not because of a lack of emotion, but because the emotion had been worn down to the point where there was no space left to express it. Leaving in solitude was Vince Carter's way of protecting what remained of himself, even though he knew the price was being remembered with anger instead of truth. And in that silence, he carried a bitter lesson. Sometimes, you leave not because you no longer love the place, but because the place no longer has the ability to see you as a human being, only holding on to the image they want to remember. After leaving Toronto, Vince Carter entered a phase where the spotlight no longer sought him out, and it was precisely in that darkness that a quiet process of evolution began. There were no more pre-game promos centered solely on his name, no more crowds showing up just to wait for a dunk that would revive old memories. Vince Carter was now a player among many others, and that change, though painful, gave him something he had lost long ago: the right to remake himself. He began changing his style of play not because he wanted to prove anything, but because his body and circumstances forced him to. The leaps that once came instinctively now became rare, carefully considered choices. In their place came more consistent outside shooting, sharper game-reading ability, passes placed perfectly in the right moment. Vince learned to play more with his mind than his legs, with patience rather than explosiveness, and every change happened when no one was really paying attention. There was no applause for shooting better from beyond the arc, no ovation for smarter defense, no headlines for extending his career by sacrificing the image that had once made him famous. Every step of growth took place in silence, as if the world had decided his story was over, that whatever remained was just leftover from an old legend. Vince Carter didn't resist that indifference. He accepted it as a necessary condition for survival. In empty gyms, he honed every small detail of his new game, knowing no one was waiting for the results, but he himself had no other choice but to keep going. This evolution didn't bring a sense of victory, because no one stood up to cheer when he succeeded, but it brought something else, quieter. The feeling that he was extending his career through his own effort, not through past fame. Vince began to understand that real maturity rarely comes with noise, and sometimes not being seen is a sign that you're heading in the right direction. He played for teams that no longer treated him as the central icon, but as a piece of the structure, a necessary but replaceable part. In that role, he learned to listen more, speak less, lead through actions rather than aura. With each passing season, Vince Carter added another layer of toughness, not to fight injuries, but to fight the feeling of being forgotten. There were nights he left the court with modest stats, no highlights to replay, but inside, he felt calmer than during the years when expectations hunted him down. That calm wasn't happiness, but acceptance. Acceptance that this journey no longer belonged to brilliant moments, but to endurance. Vince Carter evolved in the dark, because that was the only place he was allowed to change without being compared to his past. Every time he adjusted the pace of a game, every time he chose to stand in the right spot instead of chasing the spotlight, was another affirmation that his real self was still alive, even if unseen. There was no applause for patience, no awards for adaptation, but Vince kept going because he understood that evolution doesn't always lead to recognition. Some kinds of growth only matter to the person experiencing them, and some victories exist only in silence. When looking back on this phase, few remember the small details that helped Vince Carter extend his career, because they weren't spectacular enough to become collective memory. But those very details were the foundation for his continued existence in a league that waits for no one. Vince Carter no longer soared to make the world gasp. He walked more slowly, more steadily, in the shadow of the legend he had once created. And in that shadow, with no guiding lights, there was only one choice: keep evolving, even if no one was watching, even if every step of growth happened without a single round of applause. The following years of Vince Carter were no longer measured by soaring moments or standing ovations, but by the quiet endurance of a body that had long since pushed far beyond its natural limits. Joint pain became the background noise of every morning, a feeling so familiar that he could no longer distinguish what was real pain and what was just the leftover from yesterday that hadn't yet left. Recurring injuries no longer arrived like accidents, but as the inevitable result of thousands of landings, of years spent living in the gravity he had once defied. There were mornings when Vince Carter woke up and had to sit on the edge of the bed for a very long time, not to think, but to wait for his body to allow him to stand straight, for his knees to stop protesting, for his back to agree to cooperate for one more day. He learned to warm up longer than others, to walk more carefully, to hide the pain behind a calm face, because in this world, no one waited for a confession of fatigue from someone who had once soared so high. But even as his body wore down more and more, Vince still took the court, not because he didn't know when to stop, but because stopping would mean admitting that time had won completely, and he wasn't ready for that admission. Every game now was a negotiation with himself. He weighed every run, every leap, every landing, as if rationing what remained of his body for an unforgiving schedule. There were days he played, feeling like he was borrowing his own legs temporarily, knowing they could return pain at any moment. But the physical tragedy of Vince Carter wasn't in the pain itself, but in the fact that he wasn't allowed to collapse. For a young player, injury is a story told with sympathy. For an aging legend, injury is often seen as proof that it's time to go. Vince understood that better than anyone, and that very understanding made him even more silent, made him shoulder even more himself. He didn't want to become the story of someone once great who couldn't accept reality, nor did he want to become the excuse for people to say he had stayed too long. So, he chose the hardest path, continuing to take the court in silence, enduring pains no one saw, to prove that his presence still had meaning, even if no longer brilliant. Small injuries accumulated into a map of pain across his body, each point tied to a season, a team, a phase he had survived more by will than by strength. There were nights he left the court with slow steps, went to the locker room, and sat still for a very long time, not out of sadness, but because his body needed time to return to a state where it could move. In those moments, there were no cameras, no fans, only the raw truth of a man paying the price for having lived too long on the court. But even when his body protested most fiercely, Vince Carter maintained an iron discipline, because it was the only thing he still controlled. He adjusted his training regimen, changed his recovery methods, listened to the smallest signals from his body, as if learning a new language where every mistake had to be paid for. That endurance didn't bring glory, but it extended his career year after year, season after season, game after game, while many from his generation had long since left. The physical tragedy of Vince Carter stretched across decades, not because he was reckless, but because he understood that every day he stepped on the court was a day he proved to himself that he was still here. There were mornings he couldn't stand straight, but by evening he still walked onto the court looking ready to play, because he knew the world only saw what happened under the lights, not the hours before when he had to fight his own body. And it was in that contrast that the tragedy grew deeper. The outside world grew accustomed to the image of a Vince Carter who kept going, while the inside man bore the consequences of that continuation. He didn't seek pity, didn't want his story told as a loud tragedy, because from very early on, he had learned that silence was the only way to survive in systems that didn't allow weakness. But silence didn't make the pain disappear. It only made the pain become part of his identity. Vince Carter stepped onto the court not because he didn't know his body was wearing down, but because he refused to let that wearing down define his ending. And in that decision, there was a profound sadness that only those who have lived too long with pain can understand. Sometimes not collapsing isn't a sign of strength, but a sign of a will so accustomed to enduring that there are no other choices left. When Vince Carter entered the final years of his career, the overwhelming feeling was no longer physical pain or the pressure to prove anything, but the thick, heavy loneliness of someone who had stayed too long. The generation that started this journey with him gradually disappeared from the locker room. The faces that once understood his glances without words, the people who knew what it felt like to soar when the body was still whole, who shared long flights and exhausting seasons, now existed only in memory. With each passing season, Vince Carter looked around and realized the familiar conversations were gone. The old stories had no one left to retell them, and the memories that were once present had become his own private past. The old generation vanished quietly, without dramatic goodbyes. They left the way time usually does, silently but decisively. On the other side, a new generation entered the league with a different speed and language, bringing new standards for success, image, and how to exist in the NBA. They knew Vince Carter through old videos, perfectly edited highlights, stories retold like legends, but they didn't understand the man sitting in front of them in the locker room. To them, he was both a legend and something distant, hard to approach like a piece of history kept out of respect rather than necessity. Vince felt that distance clearly in practices, on road trips, in the way young players looked at him with a mix of awe and confusion, unsure how to talk to someone who had lived through 4 decades of the NBA. He didn't blame them, because he understood that no one can truly grasp a journey they haven't lived. But that lack of understanding slowly turned Vince Carter into a breathing memory, a man living in the present while carrying an entire past that no one else shared. He sat in the locker room, listening to conversations about social media, contracts, the modern pace of the game, and realized he no longer belonged to those topics, just as his topics no longer belonged to them. This loneliness didn't come from being abandoned, but from having no one left standing at the same starting point. Vince Carter still took the court, still practiced, still maintained strict discipline, but every step carried the feeling that he was walking alone on a path he had once opened. There were moments he looked around the arena and realized no one on the floor had ever faced him in the early years of his career. No one clearly remembered the feel of the NBA before everything changed. He became a bridge between two eras, but a bridge isn't always stood upon. It exists so others can cross. And in that role, Vince Carter accepted that his presence was no longer there to be understood, but to be respected from afar. His loneliness wasn't dramatic, with no tears, no public breakdowns. It existed in small details, like no one calling him by his old nickname anymore, like the stories he told no longer met with shared memories, like every time he stepped onto the court, he knew he was the only one there who had lived in a completely different NBA. Vince Carter didn't try to cling to that closeness, because he had grown accustomed to silently accepting things that couldn't be changed. But that silence only made one truth clearer. The one who lives the longest is often the loneliest. When you stay long enough, you don't just witness the game change, you witness the disappearance of the connections that once gave the journey meaning. Vince Carter kept playing, not because he didn't recognize that loneliness, but because he understood it was the price for choosing to stay. He carried the past of an entire generation while walking through a present that no longer had room for it, and it was in that intersection that he existed as a breathing memory, not fully belonging to yesterday, nor truly to today. Amid all the changes, the consecutive seasons, and the growing clarity of loneliness, Vince Carter still had one place where time seemed to slow down, where he didn't need to explain who he was or had been, his family. There were no chants of his name, No titles tied to dunks or records spanning decades. No expectations beyond him being fully present as a husband, a father, an ordinary person. Family became the most natural refuge, not because it shielded him from the world, but because in that space, the world didn't demand he prove anything. When Vince stepped through his front door, the pressures of the locker room and the arena stayed behind. He was no longer the icon of an era or a breathing memory. Just a man coming home after a long day, tired, in a very ordinary way. No one asked how many points he scored today. No one waited for a spectacular moment to applaud. And that very absence of questions brought a rare sense of peace. Family didn't need him to soar, didn't need him to extend his career one more season. They just needed him there long enough to share dinner, attentive enough to listen, present enough for small moments to unfold without being interrupted by the schedule. But even in that peace, a quiet paradox existed. Family was the place where Vince Carter didn't need to prove anything, but also the place where he chose to hide all his pain. He didn't bring the joint pain, the mornings when he couldn't stand straight, the nights when his body protested fiercely into family conversations because he didn't want to turn the only true refuge into a space of worry. Vince had grown used to carrying everything himself, and that habit followed him even when he came home. He smiled, stayed calm, so his loved ones wouldn't have to carry any extra burden from a journey they couldn't take for him. Family loved him not for what he had done on the court, but for who he was. And precisely because of that, Vince was even more unwilling to let the inner cracks disrupt that fragile balance. There were evenings he sat quieter than usual, not because he was sad, but because his body needed rest, because his mind needed to unwind after hours of tension. Family understood that silence wasn't distance, but his way of existing, and they accepted it as a natural part of who he was. In that space, Vince Carter learned to live more slowly, even if only in brief moments between trips and games. He found comfort in small things, a simple meal, an aimless conversation, an evening with no plan. But even when surrounded by that normalcy, the pains he carried didn't disappear. They only settled, waiting until he had to step back out into the world. Family didn't erase the physical and emotional tragedies Vince Carter had accumulated, but they gave him a reason to keep enduring them. Because when everything became too heavy, when the loneliness on the court and in the locker room rose up, Vince knew there was one place he could return to without being asked why, without being judged by past or present. Family was where he didn't need to prove anything, but also where he quietly protected others from his own wounds. And in that protection, there was a silent but enduring love, enough to keep him standing one more day, one more season, even though the price was always him, continuing to hide the deepest pains for himself. When Vince Carter moved into the phase where the central role no longer called his name, he faced a truth harder to swallow than any physical pain. To stay, he had to accept disappearing. No longer the face on posters, no longer the focal point of cameras, Vince Carter learned to shrink his presence just enough not to disrupt the structure, just enough to bring value without demanding attention. He accepted a smaller role not because of a lack of pride, but because he understood it was the only path left for someone who had lived too long with his own legend. Shorter minutes on the court, simpler plays, decisions not aimed at creating highlights, all were conscious choices from a man who clearly understood his current limits and respected them. In the gym, Vince was no longer the one jumping the highest. He was the first to arrive, the last to leave, fine-tuning every small detail for young players still figuring out how to break through. He taught them how to plant their feet correctly, how to read gaps, how to control breathing under rising pressure, things that never appear in highlight reels. Teaching others to fly while he himself could no longer fly was a painful paradox that Vince accepted without complaint. Every instruction was a confrontation with memories of what he once could do, but also an affirmation that his value didn't end with his vertical leap. The emotional peak of this phase wasn't in a game or a stat line, but in the repeated daily choice, staying by erasing himself from the center. Vince Carter stepped back so others could move forward, stood still so the team's rhythm could flow past, stayed out of the lights so the room could operate in order. He understood that the most useful presence is sometimes the one that causes no interference, and in a league chasing the new, that calm was rare. There were nights he didn't play, sitting on the bench, observing every situation like a quiet gatekeeper, ready to step in when needed, but never demanding. Young players might not call his name in celebration moments, but they carried the lessons he left behind, invisible and enduring. Vince accepted that history no longer wrote his name at the top line. It flowed through him to reach others. And in that acceptance, there was a subtle sadness, but also a release. He no longer had to strain to become what the world expected. He only needed to be what the team needed. Staying by erasing himself from the center wasn't failure. It was a rare form of courage in elite sports, the courage to step out of the light, to preserve meaning. Vince Carter walked through those months with a quiet demeanor, never seeking praise for his sacrifice, because he knew the right sacrifices often have no audience. But it was in that silence that he found a new wholeness, the wholeness of a man who had learned that flying isn't always about lifting yourself higher. Sometimes it's about lifting others, even when your own wings have grown tired. Vince Carter's final game arrived like just another day on the schedule, not circled in red on the league's calendar, no weeks-long media campaign reminding everyone that an era was about to close. No tribute ceremony, no pre-game highlight reels rolling before tip-off, no orchestrated standing ovations to send off a name that once shook the entire NBA. The game unfolded amid the familiar rhythm of the season, where people were busy with standings, with the future, with young faces expected to shape tomorrow. Vince Carter stepped onto the court with the same routine that had followed him for years, slowly tying his shoes, warming up thoroughly, checking his body as if negotiating one more time with time itself. No one was really waiting for his appearance. No one held their breath to see if he could still soar like the old memories. And it was the absence of those expectations that made the atmosphere feel stranger than any roar. On the floor, every step Vince took echoed clearly in the sound of shoes scraping the hardwood dry, real, uncovered by cheers. He played the way he had in those final years, calm, restrained, positioning himself exactly where needed, not chasing a special moment to close the story. There was no dunk to revive Vincanity, no explosive instant to bring the crowd to its feet, just timely plays, sufficient decisions, fully present minutes without showmanship. When the final buzzer sounded, it didn't carry the feeling of a legend's end. It felt more like the period at the end of a long workday. Vince Carter left the court, not in teammates' embraces or under a shower of flashbulbs, but in familiar quiet. The locker room that day felt emptier than usual, not because of missing people, but because of the lack of any special event atmosphere. He sat down, untied his shoes, wiped the sweat's slow movements, as if wanting to stretch out those final moments a little longer, but no one stood waiting for a formal goodbye. No collective tears, no lingering hugs in front of cameras, just the stillness of a space already rearranged for tomorrow, a tomorrow where Vince Carter would no longer be part of it. And in that moment, the way he left perfectly reflected the way he had lived for 30 years. Quietly, without demands, without clinging. He didn't need a grand finale to prove anything, because he had spent his entire career proving it through endurance, through staying when no one was waiting anymore. Vince walked out of the locker room, down the long, empty hallway, his footsteps echoing then fading, with no fans waiting to applaud. The final game wasn't remembered as a major event, but for him, it closed a journey where every step carried the price of time. Vince Carter left the court the way he had lived, without fanfare, without noise, leaving behind not the echo of a moment, but the trace of a man who stayed long enough to understand that sometimes silence is the most honest goodbye. 30 years have passed since the day Vince Carter stepped into the NBA, and when looking back on that entire journey, people can easily list what he didn't have. No championship ring to place on the table as the final proof of greatness. No collective apology from the cities that once turned their backs. No belated acknowledgement that the world had once been too harsh on him, but it is precisely in that absence that Vince Carter's story becomes rawer and more painful than any glory. He didn't walk through this career shielded by collective victories, but as an individual who had to bear every consequence of staying too long, flying too high, and enduring in silence too stubbornly. When the lights went out, when new generations kept running forward, what remained wasn't the stat sheet, but a human being who had paid the full price for every year of existence on the court. Vince Carter paid with his body, with joints no longer intact, with mornings when he couldn't stand straight, but still stepped onto the court as if there were no other choice. He paid with the loneliness of the one who outlived them all, when those who once understood him had left, and those who remained didn't truly understand. He paid with being framed in one glorious moment to the point that every effort to mature afterward was downplayed. But the most remarkable thing isn't that price, it's the way he accepted it. Vince Carter didn't resent the world for not granting him the final thing people usually use to define a legend. He didn't blame Toronto for remembering him with anger, didn't blame the media for simplifying the story, didn't blame the fans for only wanting to see a version that belonged to the past. He chose silence, not out of weakness, but because he understood that some things, even if spoken, wouldn't change the way people want to believe. In that silence, his character emerged clearer than any title. A man who knew how to endure without needing pity, who knew how to adapt without losing dignity, who knew how to step back so others could move forward without turning it into a moral proclamation. 30 years of Vince Carter were 30 years of difficult choices, where every decision to stay came with a portion of loss. But he still stayed, not to be remembered as a stubborn hero, but to fulfill what he believed was his responsibility to this game. There was no apology from the world, but also no blame from him. What remained after everything was a life without resentment, a rare calm in an environment that always encourages comparison and judgment. When looking back, people can argue about Vince Carter's place in NBA history, about where he deserves to rank in the endless lists. But those arguments don't touch the core of the story. Because Vince Carter didn't live to win debates. He lived to complete a journey. Very few have the patience to see through to the end. He didn't need to be called the greatest, because he proved something far harder, that a human being can go through 3 decades of peak and decline without losing himself. That character wasn't in the explosive moments, but in the days no one waited for, in the games no one remembered, in maintaining discipline and respect for the game even when the final reward never came. Vince Carter lived long enough to understand that glory comes and goes, but how you face its departure is what stays. And that's why the tragic ending of this story isn't that he had no championship ring, but that he had to carry the burden of time alone without a fitting closing ceremony. But in that tragedy, there is a quiet nobility. He didn't demand, didn't bargain, didn't turn pain into a tool for sympathy. He simply kept living, kept doing what he believed was right, until there was nothing left to prove. 30 years in review, Vince Carter didn't leave a noisy legacy, but a silent standard of endurance and dignity. He gave the world moments to remember, but didn't demand the world remember him in any specific way. And that may be the most beautiful tragedy of this life. A man who paid the full price for his journey, who gave more than he ever received back, and still walked away without bitterness. Because some people don't live to be remembered. They live so others have something to remember. Looking back on the entire story of Vince Carter, The lingering feeling isn't the excitement of the dunks that once shook the NBA, but a deep, slow, and very human sadness. Sorrow, because behind the 2000 dunk contest moment where the whole world cheered, Vincanity was the starting point of a shadow too large, imprisoning him for decades. Heartache, because from Toronto, where he was turned from savior to betrayer in silence, to the final years of his career, Vince Carter chose not to justify, not to defend, letting the truth be distorted, and memory simplified into anger. His story reveals a very American tragedy, a society that worships brilliant success, but has little patience for slowing down, for aging, for the human being behind the icon. His acceptance of a smaller role, stepping back from the center to teach the next generation how to fly when he himself could no longer fly, or the image of his final game without tribute, only the sound of shoes and an empty locker room, are painful but noble details that show the dignity of a man who placed responsibility above ego. From that story, the lesson for Americans isn't about having to become the greatest, but about how to face change. Learning to respect those who have given even when they're no longer at the peak, learning not to frame a person in one successful moment, and most importantly, learning to measure the value of a life not just by titles, but by character, endurance, and the ability to live without resentment. Vince Carter reminds us that, in a society always rushing forward, sometimes the most humane thing is to pause and look back at the people who quietly paid the full price for their journey. Thank you for staying until the end, to listen to the quiet but deeply character-filled story of Vince Carter. If you value journeys that aren't loud, but paid for with an entire lifetime, please hit subscribe to keep joining us. See you in the next video, where we'll continue looking straight at the real stories behind the arena lights and the people who lived long enough to understand the value of silence.